So, Fran, thanks for coming back on the show, and let's talk about narcissism. But before we do that, let's introduce ourselves.
Okay.
My name is Dr. Kirk Honda. I'm a therapist and a professor. Who are you, Fran?
Hi, I'm Frances Schopick. I am an MSW as well as an attorney. I work these days as an attorney. I represent counselors or Department of Health licensees who have problems with DOH complaints, as well as I give talks on record keeping and various risk management issues, disclosure forms, documentation, speaking in court, various things like that.
Yeah. I would call you, Fran, a super expert on ethics and on legal matters when it comes to us in the mental health field. There are people who are experts who might teach continuing education classes, and then there are super experts who perhaps know more than anyone else based on their experience and their dedication to the topic, and you're one of those people. So thanks for joining us. But today we're going to be talking about narcissism.
Yeah.
And you and I have not talked about anything prior to this moment, so I have no idea what's going to come out of your face. What kind of things do you want to talk about?
I've been giving talks in the community that have three parts to them. One is called, Are You a Narcissist Magnet? One is called How to Repel a Narcissist. And the third is How to Recover from Relationships with a Narcissist and Deciding What's Right for You. Now, these talks are based from the point of view of a person who finds him or herself constantly getting into a repeated pattern of having basically the same relationship over and over with someone who fails to put their needs either first or even equal to their own. So that's one way of looking at the problem. Now, another way of looking at the problem, and given my role as an attorney who represents counselors, is that counselors often don't understand the dynamic of a person who's involved repeatedly with a narcissist or a person with narcissistic qualities. And so the counselors sometimes end up unwittingly colluding with the person who has the narcissistic behaviors and can actually harm their own clients, who are the people who usually become involved with people. I say that the clients are usually the ones who become involved with people with narcissistic behaviors because people who are narcissists don't generally go to therapy. They're the ones who come to therapy because their partner demands it, and so they might come. They're very good at mastering the process and even fooling the therapist so that the therapist ends up unwittingly or not colluding with that person. I want to say I come to this experience, to this topic with a lot of experience. As a social worker, I worked on a research project in New York City on mood and personality disorders. So I routinely interviewed people with narcissistic personality disorder, borderline personality disorder, antisocial personality disorder, and also schizotypal personality disorder. But it's really those three that we're focusing on more in general here. And then I worked in the Bronx, New York, with people who were court mandated to services because they were the perpetrators of domestic violence, both male and female, although the percentages there are many more male perpetrators in the court system than female. And I worked with the targets or victims of domestic violence. And there's also something called coercive control, which is a more subtle form of domestic violence, but nonetheless very difficult. Now, I come to this believing that I'm not so concerned about whether a person fulfills full criteria as per the DSM-5 for narcissistic personality disorder or antisocial or borderline. I think it's more important to look at the behaviors that can be so disruptive and problematic for relationships. But having said that, I want to say that I'm not casting one type of person as good and the other as bad. I think particularly in terms of certain areas of society, being a narcissistic person can be quite useful. I mean, if you're a person, for instance, who believes that you have a concept, an invention that everybody else is telling you is just simply impossible, but you believe in it, it might take a little bit of arrogance or entitlement or something to really stick to it and to the point of fruition. I think also antisocial personality disorder, there can be some advantages to that. If we need someone to go into battle for us as a country, if somebody who's highly relational and has all sorts of empathy and compassion for the person before them, that might not be the most useful characteristic if you're in the middle of a battle.
Right. And if you want to advocate for certain topics related to psychology, and you want to start a podcast, having a little bit of arrogance and entitlement to your opinions and loving to hear yourself talk, certainly lends itself to becoming a podcaster. And a little bit of antisocial with the comfort with breaking rules and not really caring about, pushing the boundaries and saying things that are going to bother some people also lends itself to podcasting.
Right. And that's why it's important, I think, to identify what it is you're looking to talk about. Because if you're looking to talk about relationships and how some of these behaviors can be destructive toward relationships, then I think it can be useful. I think it's important to look at both sides. I think the way I like to talk about it is I find myself talking about relational versus transactional people and hyper-relational and hyper-transactional people. I think the ideal actually is for all of us to be kind of what I call relationally transactional. That if someone doesn't meet exactly all of your needs, even as a relational person, to throw them away, I don't think that's useful. I think what can be useful is to say, this person has been a good friend in certain ways. They're not my perfect friend. They don't do everything as I hope it would work out, but I'm not going to throw this person away. Mm-hmm. So I think, we can look at the extremes of the hyper-relational person and the hyper-transactional and everywhere in between. Also, when we talk about narcissism, and I know you know this, but we're talking about a continuum so that we all are considered to have what's called healthy narcissism, which means that we all, hopefully, want to do the best we can. We want to be as attractive as we can or as accomplished as we can be. That doesn't make a person narcissistic in the full-blown sense of the word. That's why I'm not as concerned with whether a person fulfills full criteria for narcissistic personality disorder as really what are the characteristics that they display and whether it creates problems within a relationship. If it creates problems within a relationship, then it's up to each person to ask themselves if they want to change it and if it's worthwhile and helpful. They have the choice of staying in a relationship, making it work, or walking away. And just to make those choices in a conscious way is, I think, what's important.
So you said that you see counselors, correct me if I'm wrong, becoming manipulated by their narcissistic clients. And they will go to court, and as an expert witness in the courtroom watching this, you're like, oh boy, I think that therapist is being manipulated by a narcissistic client. Is that what you're saying?
No. Well, first of all, it's not usually the narcissist who comes for therapy.
Right.
It can occur. But what's more likely is that there's, let's say, a relationship and a person who's involved with a person who's hyper-relational, that is to say, who stays within a relationship with somebody who's narcissistic, and that person feels that they're not getting their needs met, but they so much want to be in a relationship or so much might need to be in a relationship, such as if they share children or something. They so much want to or feel they need to stay in that relationship that they are bypassing their needs. So that person is usually the one who's in therapy. They might bring in a person with more narcissistic behaviors. They might bring that person into therapy because they're kind of saying, we need to work this out. But then what can happen is that the narcissistic person comes to therapy with the relational person's therapist, and generally speaking, the ways that these things can play out is that the therapist might help his or her client, for instance, identify their needs. So they might say to the client, well, did you tell him or her how you feel? Did you tell them, well, when you do this, I feel that, and so please don't do that? That might be one way that they'll handle it. But if you're dealing with somebody who's a narcissist, which is to say someone who is transactionally oriented, who does not care about your needs, then what that method will possibly do, the danger, is that method actually lays out a landscape for how to abuse the person. That if the person says, every time you talk to me in that tone, I feel really insecure, and it reminds me of the way my father spoke to me. Now you've given, if it's a person who's really interested in a relationship, that's great. Now you know that you've told them how they speak in that tone and what it does to you in your heart. And if that person cares about you, they'll try to change their tone. Every time they hear themselves with that tone, they'll try to change it. They'll think, oh my gosh, that person, my partner is really upset by this. I don't mean to do that. I'm reminding him or her of how they were treated as children. But if it's a person who is transactional and who's actually enjoying finding power over you, then you've just given him or her a map into how to abuse that person. You've just given them insight into how to say, oh, well, if I talk to them this way, I'm going to make them feel insecure because that's how their father spoke to them. And now I know exactly what to do when I want to do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And tell me what you think about this, because this is my conceptualization. And I also have specialized in treating these sorts of personality disorders, not so much antisocial, but a little bit, but borderline, histrionic, narcissistic. And also see it very much on a spectrum. I put myself on the spectrum. I'm like 5%. My co-host Umberto has been labeled by the listeners, mainly Emily Capelli, another social worker, by the way, who gives him, I think she's a social worker, gives him, I think 15% or something. Mm-hmm. It's sort of an arbitrary number, but meaning that it's not normal narcissism. It has pros and cons. There's the pros that we laid out earlier, but there's the cons of a little bit of impaired empathy at times, a bit of a need to have a veil of superiority to protect oneself. And so I feel personally in touch with the causes and the syndrome to a certain extent. I could imagine if it was 10 times worse, just how much destruction I would, lay waste to the world, including people around me, and also have treated people like this before. And so the way that I see it that leads to this behavior that you're describing is that due to relational situations when they're growing up, namely abuse and or being left to their own devices is another common cause sometimes, emotional neglect, this sort of thing. They meet a point where they have to decide how they're going to cope with that early in life, say at the age of 2 or 3 or something. And one of the coping styles available to humans, because it's so common, is to say, you know what, I'm being treated badly or I'm not getting my needs met, and I'm going to decide that other people are dumb and it's their fault that I'm not getting my needs met. I am superior. I don't need anyone else. I'm good on my own and screw everyone else. And in order to get my needs met, I can't depend on other people, i.e., I have to take what I need from other people. Mm-hmm. I need closeness. I need love. I need security. I need safety. I need self-esteem. And the only way to get that, given my scenario early in life, is to manipulate and take and force and coerce other people to get my needs met. And I'm going to not really pay attention to their feelings because it actually doesn't help me. And no one's caring about my feelings. So, this is just how the world works. And this is, of course, all subconscious, developmental, even neuronal, you could say, growing up. And so fast forward 40 years, and you have someone who has a heavily impaired ability to even know what's in someone else's mind, let alone care. They will talk about themselves like they're awesome and everything. They can't apologize. They can't admit. They can't even. You hook them up to a lie detector. They don't even think they're wrong. It's not like they're just faking. They actually are slightly incapable of believing that they've done something wrong, because when they are pushed to that point that they have done something wrong, it bursts past the veil, and suddenly they're faced with actually how they really feel about themselves, which is like, not only are they terrible people, but they're almost like non-existent. They don't even really exist in the world. And when I've treated people like this, I've got, been there with them through those abysses, and it's not a pleasant place. It's a very, very place of extreme despair. And so that veil of narcissism is necessary for survival for them. Of course, it, damages everyone around them. But that's my conceptualization. I don't, sometimes when I hear people talking about narcissism, I think what they're talking about in my linguistic system is more psychopathy, and which is a actual inability to care about what other people are thinking and feeling. So is your conceptualization of the word narcissistic personality similar to mine? Is it different? Does it overlap?
Well, from what I can tell, and to listeners, this is the first time we're speaking about this together.
Mm-hmm.
So from what I can tell, you're taking into account a lot of the theories of etiology, of how it comes about. I'm actually thinking of it more in terms of diagnosis and how it affects the relationships with people. So I think I'm fascinated by the fact that you work with people with these behaviors, and that you've had it sounds like you've had a lot of success.
And I used to work with DV perpetrators and saw a lot of it there too.
Yeah, and it sounds like you've had a lot of success in breaking through that wall, which is wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd love to hear more about that at some time. I'm seeing it more from the
victims.
Well, from the I think of it as from the dynamic point of view. I don't really like the word victim. I think there is a certain way in which people are targets of these behaviors. There are good targets for it, but I'm looking more at the behaviors themselves. So, for instance, let's say somebody had diabetes, which puts them at risk for heart disease, and let's say they had a genetic predisposition toward that, like both parents and all the grandparents had problems like that. I'm not looking so much at the etiology, although that can be interesting. I would be looking at more, if a person has this genetic predisposition or vulnerability, what can they do about it? Or how do they handle it? And how does it affect their relationships? Because in terms of society or community, having some people be so dominant in terms of a narcissistic spectrum, and then other people being non-dominant, creates patterns in terms of leadership, in terms of community, and all of that. So that's and in terms of people's access even to the court system. I mean, all of these things can be subverted within these dynamics. I think it's important to look at everybody's predispositions. I think, I ask the question, why do people get involved in these relationships? Why does the more relational person become involved in these relationships over and over again? And I think that it's important to understand that. I don't think it's good enough to just say, well, that's what happens to me, and this other person is terrible. I think it's really important to take responsibility from both sides.
So what do you tell people? You have a person that you're consulting with you or in your class, and they're saying, oh my God, you're describing me, which I'm guessing you've had before. And they're just like, oh my God, I've had, 5 relationships I can think of, and they were all exactly the sort of person you're talking about, and you're describing my experience. Mm-hmm. Why am I like this? What do you say?
Well, usually before getting to why am I like this, I'll go through the behaviors themselves and how, just so that they are at that point. I mean, I hear them groaning in the back of the room, and they'll say, oh my God, this is like you've been in my living room for 15 years. And it's really pretty sobering. It's a very sobering experience, because people are realizing that they are not alone, which is kind of good. But then again, they're not alone. That means that it's happening all over the place. So either way, it's difficult. It's a difficult pill to swallow. In terms of why people are like this, I think I guess it's possible, but I would think it highly rare for somebody to actually have the first relationship ever come about now. Like, this has never happened to me before. I'm 45 years old. It's never happened to me before. Where did this come from? For the most part, people are groomed for it, meaning that they come from a situation early in life when they've learned to put other people's needs first, or they've learned to lose connection with their own gut responses. They've learned that they do not get to be the subject of their sentence. So and that can happen in various ways. It can happen, sometimes a person is raised by a narcissistic parent, let's say, or by a parent who teaches them to do things, to cheat or to steal. So to put to just think about the parent will be talking about what you need and will teach the child to do that. But it can happen if you grow up in a family where there's some form of substance abuse, where the moodiness of the parents can be really flagrant, and you just learn that the best thing you can do is go hide or put other people's needs first. Figure out.
Really pay attention to that person, hyper-focus, so that you can manage them and also react to what stage of drunk they're in.
Exactly.
Or that kind of thing.
Yep. I've known people, sibships, groups of children with their siblings, 4 or 5 siblings. one of them, each day they would rotate the person who would be sent into the house first to sort of assess what mom's state of mind is or what dad's state of mind is, and then go back to the rest of them, and just with eye signals to signal whether she's drunk or whether she's not, or he's in a fit of rage or not. And then the sibs would all, this is coming home from school, they would all figure out how to behave.
I had a similar situation. Someone was telling me this story about how she could tell by the way her father walked toward the front door how the night was going to go for her.
Yeah. And that's a very common description from people who've grown up with these behaviors, because they become hypersensitive to it for adaptive reasons, to survive.
And then they deny the self,
Yeah.
and they learn to have safety and maybe a little bit of love. They have to deny the self, and they have to manage other people and pay very close attention to their needs.
Right.
Because that's when good things happen for you.
And there are other ways people can become groomed too. You can become groomed. I've seen it where there might be a family member who has some form of disability, so that the lion's share of time, attention, care, concern, money, all of those things, understandably, go to that person's survival or that person's treatment. It can also happen, I've also seen it happen, where there's someone with a particular talent. So, for instance, a child prodigy, where all the money, time, attention goes into helping that child get the instrument that they need, or be in a position where they can be taught by the people that they need, the teachers or the mentors.
And then siblings of that person are the people who grow up to be patterned with narcissists.
Well, they learn to put other people's needs first. They learn that within this family, it's the prodigy who needs the attention, or it's the person who's ill who needs the attention.
And not them.
And not them. And so, and they can handle that different ways. Some children would say, no, I'm not going to put up with this. I want to be front stage too. But there are some times, there's that Alice Miller book, The Drama of the Gifted Child. Do you know that book?
Yeah.
So basically where the gifted child is the one, I would say the burdened child, but that's the child who learns to read the other parent or read the situation. And then a last example, I think, can be with families where people come from other countries, and often parents and grandparents who are developmentally the ones who are taking care of the children, but they don't speak the language. And so you'll often see children who are 6 or 7 or 8, they're the ones who speak English and who are doing the negotiations with the landlord, or with the, with paying for food, or
growing up too fast,
going to the schools. Yeah. And that's a good way to put it, growing up too fast. But again, there can be a trade-off. There might be almost some pleasure taken in having a position of responsibility, but at the same time, they never get to be a kid.
Right. It is a source of great self-esteem that was supported by rewards socially around them, maybe even practically, like more freedoms or control of the money in the family or something. And they that's one thing to point out that I will talk to with clients of mine who are trying to separate themselves or are trying to navigate a relationship with someone with narcissistic personality, is that by the time they come to me, they'll be able to say, I don't like this person, I don't like their behavior. And as we start to explore it, they're just like, oh my God, like you're describing, my spouse exactly. And, what do we do? And I, of course, never give advice. I don't care. It's just and there's a lot of options to people. Sometimes staying with the person, people will do that. And there's ways to navigate that to a life that is well for everyone. But so a little bit on that is that as I have treated people similar to the people that have been in your class, they will, upon starting to separate, even if it's just emotionally speaking, like they start to say, I'm going to start drawing boundaries here. I'm not going to listen to them lecture me for 2 hours. I'm not going to put myself in the back burner. I'm not going to let their tirades like rule my life. If they want to react that way, then that's not their choice. And I'm going to say, well, you can react that way if you want to, but that's not my problem, And as they do that, that self-esteem starts to be challenged, because they actually get some personal pleasure as to being that person that is helping that other person. And so they're taking away some of their own behaviors that actually make themselves feel good. There's a certain ironic superiority in that person's position. They'll often feel like, certainly my spouse is very high on themselves and, might be achieving a lot and very outward focused. And a common scenario is everyone loves him, everyone at work loves him. And if they only knew what he was really like when he was at home. And they will kind of get a little bit of self-esteem from the fact that they know they're better than their spouse. They tolerate emotions better. They're not as mean. And there's a dynamic there that the person suffering from that relationship has to give up. And without a way of getting that self-esteem in some other way, they might be compelled to go back to that person against their will, so to speak. Do you ever find things like that?
Well, it's a very complex dynamic. I think really what you're pointing out is how complex the dynamic is, that sometimes what I'll call the relational person, let me just define that when I say a relational person, I'm thinking of a person who enjoys relationship for the sake of relationship. A transactional person I think of as a person who enjoys relationship for the sake of the transaction, for the sake of what they get out of it. In general, the relational person is the person who finds themselves to be the target of the person with narcissistic behaviors. And in general, the person with narcissistic behaviors is the transactional person. So for instance, I've actually heard somebody say, I overheard someone once say to someone else, we should be friends, it would be really useful. And to me, that was a shocking statement. But to that person, she meant it in the most benign way. I think she simply meant that if we were friends, that we could get a lot out of each other. We could exploit each other's capabilities in a positive way. I mean, I don't think she meant anything like it, particularly about it, except that it was a transactional statement that I wouldn't have seen myself making. So I think to some extent, people who are, quote, relational might become involved with the more transactional or narcissistic person because they do enjoy having, there's kind of a deferred sunshine that comes from it, where you, just by association, you get to be, you can attain a certain station. The problem is, and all of these things, it really just has to do with whether there's a problem in the relationship. If you find yourself involved with somebody who's narcissistic and this person, runs the show, but you're happy with how it works, then I don't know, it's not necessarily for us to call that a problem. It's really just when these things when people are suffering or where they're being abused on some level, that I think it becomes problematic, and then it becomes important to look at it. And if the person is trying to get out of that dynamic and finds him or herself constantly repeating it, almost like an obsessive repetition compulsion, then it can be important. It's up to them to decide, but if it's important to them to look at it, then it can be important to sort of affirm or bear witness to it.
So you do classes on this or consultations, is that right?
I've given talks on it. It's really as a community service.
If people wanted to sign up are you doing these in the future, or will you be doing these in the future?
I might be doing some in the future.
Okay.
I don't have any scheduled right now.
So if they went to your website, they might find that. And your website is what again?
FrancesSchopick.com.
Okay. So the thing that I find with people, the relational people, that is a huge barrier to them, because once they, there's a certain group of clients that will come to me and be in that position, and they'll be like, over time, maybe a year or so, they'll decide for themselves that they don't want to be with this person anymore. They've established boundaries. They've tried it out. It's sort of working, but they've fallen out of love, and they want to try something else. And now begins what I find usually to be the case, because of the traumas the relational person went through and made them attracted to these people to begin with, is to develop a sense of self, who they are,
right.
How do they feel, what are they going through, that connection with who they are. The analogy or the metaphor that I will use is that they feel as though they don't have emotions, or they don't have needs, or there's nothing there. But what I will say is like you're looking into your bedroom and the lights are off. there's furniture in there. There's posters on the wall. There's
that's really good.
There's little journal articles or journal entries in your drawer, but the lights are off. You can't see it. So therapy and a lot of exploration and just constantly asking yourself and trying to get in connection with your emotions and your needs and who you are as a person. Eventually, the dimmer switch starts to come on, because a lot of people will be like, "I don't have a personality," or I'm nobody. And it's just like, no, you're someone. You just haven't been taught and given the space to develop that awareness of what's in that room. And so that can be years though, Meanwhile, they're still in that relationship. And maybe if they even do relieve, they're attracted to those kinds of people. And the language that I use in my psychodynamic language is that, maybe it's not necessarily psychodynamic, but it's within the theory, is that they'll sniff out those people. They will, and maybe you can talk to this in terms of what you've experienced with the people you've talked to, is that they will say, okay, no more narcissists. Here are the signs. I'm going to avoid it. And I've learned my lesson and I know what's up. The next person they start to be attracted to, the next crush, the next person they let pass the third date threshold, it's a 50-50 chance it's the same sort of person. And one, they will sniff out that person because there's not a lot of narcissistic people comparatively, right? There's a fair amount, but it's not like the majority of fish in the sea. And yet they seem to be able to find them, and they seem to be attracted to them, and they seem to ignore the signs because of the lack of ability to see into the room. That can be very distressing. And so you want a room to look into, I guess, just to extend the metaphor. And if someone else has a room with like 10,000 lights just shining into their room, a transactional person, a narcissistic person, then it's just like, well, that's a shiny room and there's things in that room. How about I just do that? And it's such an easy groove to fall into for people. It feels right. It feels comfortable. It feels non-scary at the beginning, right? And so what I tell people that I'm treating, I'll say, you're at the very beginning of this. Take your time. We'll do everything we can to make it as fast as possible, but your life is probably going to be messy, as it has been for a while, and just kind of accept that. There's no way around that, other than becoming a monk and avoiding relationships, which is an option, but not necessarily the best option. Do you find this to be true with the people you talk to?
I'm trying to think. That's a lot that you just said. I think what can happen is that people who have grown up being relational and who are attracted to these behaviors, the narcissistic behaviors, are people who have, as we said, spent a lot of time developing those skills. Their talents lie in being able to admire other people as well as to put their own needs aside. So when I was giving one talk once, I remember I said to people, let's say you're on a date and the person says to you, what do you want to do? What would you like to do this evening? And I sort of just held my arms open for everyone else to answer. And the entire room said in unison, I don't know. What do you want to do? So it's exactly what you're describing. It's not that I don't believe that they don't have something that they might like to do, but their strength is in sincerely putting the energy into the relationship, meaning you decide, I'll be happy to do it. Whatever you want to do, I'll be happy to do. So they've developed that. But the other side of what they've developed is to be, quote, non-judgmental. So whenever when we get to the part about how to repel a narcissist or how to know what you'd like to do, what you would like out of a relationship, the signs are always there that people are narcissists because it's just always, we can only be who we can be. And so very early on, even the first encounter, the signs will be there. The red flags are there. The problem is that the relational person is so invested in finding whether we could have a relationship that they ignore the signs. So, and this happens even as the relationship continues. So if someone, let's say they go out on a date and somebody just starts eating off of your plate, some people would say, hey, what are you doing? Don't eat off of my plate. A person who's primarily invested in a relationship might think, oh, isn't this sweet? He or she is so intimate. We're sharing. Isn't that nice? And so the sign was there. Now, I'm not saying you have to throw the person away on a first date. You can say, okay, well, that was a first date. Maybe they were nervous. Maybe that's how they show affection, whatever. But when you begin to see this happening over and over again, where they usurp your power or you give away your power,
is that a common sign, eating off someone else's plate, or is that just a random example?
It could be an example. One example I'm aware of, let's say, is where someone said, let's go to this restaurant. It's my favorite restaurant. And the person said, I don't like that kind of food. And then the first person said, you'll see, you'll like it. And the other person said, okay, let's do it. So the dynamic that was just traded there is, I know what I want. That's what I want us to do. The second person said, exercise a boundary and said, I don't like that. Going back to the first person, he or she said, I don't care. And then the other person said, neither do I. So that was the dynamic that was set on the first date. I think that could be a movie, it could be a poetry reading, right. It could be whatever you want. But
and then you rinse and repeat that over 5 years, and you're in a very locked-in dynamic between two people.
Right. The real answer to the how to repel a narcissist question is it's very simple. It's really just be yourself. If a narcissist is looking to be admired, that's one of the characteristics, is that they have a really rather insatiable need to be admired. All you have to do is, it's not that you have to not admire them. All you have to do is be yourself. If they're not getting the lion's share of admiration in the relationship, they will find you to be high maintenance or boring, or they'll say no chemistry. They'll just find some kind of way of distancing. But the relational person will often find that heartbreaking, because what they really want, they don't want to repel a narcissist. They want to tame a narcissist. They want to transform a narcissist into somebody who will love me as much as I love them. Yeah. That's not likely to happen.
Right, which in the psychodynamic sense is repetition compulsion of recreating their relationship with whomever groomed them, as you say, to expect and be the opposite side of the coin to the narcissist, right? They're trying to recreate the relationship they experienced growing up in an unconscious attempt to correct for it, but inadvertently recreating more trauma for themselves.
Right, and it can't be corrected because the person you're choosing is actually somebody who might be reminiscent of your earlier dynamic with a parent or a grandparent or whatever, but you're choosing somebody who actually isn't capable of that transformation. But in your own repetition compulsion, you keep trying to make it happen, and it'll never turn over. It's like a car that just doesn't turn over.
Yeah. Beyond a certain threshold, in my experience, for a narcissistic personality, I would say that's true. But before a certain threshold, I would say that there is pliability. Not that the narcissistic person is not, say you have a 40% person on narcissistic personality spectrum, according to my arbitrary little percentage thing. And they're capable of developing a dynamic where they act like a 70%, but they're also capable of developing a dynamic where they're 10%. And it depends on both people. So obviously, if the narcissistic person is aware of their narcissism, that will go a long way. And because in my conceptualization, the narcissistic person wants to be relational. Or at least they want the result of a relational attitude or personality, which is closeness and real mutual love. And so, and I've seen this play out in couples, is that you'll have someone who's 40%, and then you'll have the relational person who doesn't have a sense of self developed because of the traumas they went through. And that those kinds of interactions happen where the narcissistic person says, what do you want to do for dinner? And the relational person says, I don't know. What do you want to do? And then the narcissistic person, most people, again, if we're below a certain threshold of narcissist who actually does have the capacity to see other people and wants to know and wants to care, they want everyone to be happy, like for me, when I ask my wife, by the way, me being 5%, my wife is not on the scale. That's why we fit well together. And so if I ask her, we're not that extreme, so she'll actually answer that question. But let's say she didn't. Let's say she was just like, I don't know, what do you want to do? Well, to me, even though I would love to dictate because of my 5%, I would love to be like, well, let's do this, let's do that. But there's another part of me. It's just like, but do you want to do that? Because I don't want to. I would love to do what I want to do, but I would also not like doing what I want to do while you don't want to do it. So let's have a conversation. And in order to have that conversation, the relational person has to enter into that. They have to put effort sometimes of doing like, okay, my impulse right now is to say, I don't know, what do you want to do? But a practice of saying, okay, let me slow down because my impulse is to say this. Okay, well, you have to check. It takes a little bit longer for me to check in with myself. What do I want to do? Well, how about this? Even though you're not quite sure and you're not open to the other person, but you have to meet that person. You have to be assertive, and that takes some effort. And when you enter into the room, then the narcissistic person gets that contact, and because they're not at a higher level, so they actually do have a capacity, or an easier capacity to have empathy and that mutual love. And so now you're entering into the equation, and they can calm down their narcissism a little bit because they're getting the contact, the love, the connection, without having to mask it with their own personality. Is this making sense?
Yeah, you're saying that you're 5% and your wife is not on the scale. I would say 5% doesn't make you a narcissist. I would say that you're like healthy narcissist, like I'm hoping.
There's some cons to my narcissism, so
but you are still holding at the apex of your triangle or of your pyramid.
But to extend it to a 40% person who.
Well, I don't know that the numbers are what I mean. Just taking what's really important is whether the person can take the relationship into account. Who's in this relationship? If the other person is in this relationship in a significant way, then that's not what I'm talking about. I mean, that to me is someone who might have narcissistic characteristics. Features, but who's to say that? I mean, who's to say that person can't have a meaningful relationship?
So the kinds of people you're concerned with is the people that are beyond whatever, in my mind, a threshold is that even if the relational person inserts themselves, it will not be appreciated, and it will not.
Absolutely
it will not be accepted.
Right. I mean, it will not be appreciated. They're not looking for this person to insert themselves. They're looking for this person to insert themselves in such a way that shows admiration, and that's it. Yeah. And if that person does say, like for instance, to involve the person in the relationship, the narcissistic person might say something like, "Let me know if there's anything I can do for you. If you want, if it's a personal thing, if you want a certain gift, or if you want me to go with you to a professional dinner or a breakfast, or if I can meet your friends, whatever it is, just let me know. I really want it. You've done this for me. I want to do it for you." Great. So the relational person thinks, oh, wow, that's nice reciprocity. That's like how it should be. So then, there's this professional happy hour or something. And they say, okay, well, you said you'd come, this is happening at 6:00. Oh, no, I can't do that. I'm sorry. I'm going to be working. Okay. All right. Fine. I understand that because you're relational and you don't want to make too much of it. So then there's a breakfast the next month and it's at 7 a.m. So he's not going to be working at 7 a.m. or she. So it's like, okay, so in a month I have this thing at 7 a.m. Oh, no, that's too early. I can't possibly do that. I have it, that's just not going to work for me. Okay. So then, they keep trying. The person makes a promise and they break the promise. And the reciprocal person says, but you promised. And the other person says, yeah, well, but things change. I mean, I can't do everything I say I'm going to do. So you find that there's a pattern where the relational person never enters into it never seems to matter. And there's a huge imbalance and there's no way in. And if you do challenge it too much, then you face the narcissistic rage, which there's nothing quite like that.
Right, because you're criticizing the narcissistic person who needs to uphold that veil to survive, and to puncture holes in that is to cause the deep abyss that they feel, and then they want to protect that, and so they yell at you to get you to shut up and stop that.
Okay, so you say that they have that veil to survive, and maybe the people you've worked with do. I'm talking about a person who, and this is part of the sort of diagnostic piece of it, I'm talking about a person who knows absolutely how to function at work, how to function in a church, synagogue, Muslim, mosque, whatever, knows how to function with other people. It's really very specific toward this one relationship. where their rage or their inequities show up. And so I would submit that they do know how to behave that way. I mean, appropriately. It's actually contained quite effectively, but used for a power play in order to get the relationship they want, usually in their most intimate relationships. This doesn't usually, I mean, it might come out in a more public way, but some of these things are really particularly nefarious because they're so specific.
Right. And in my language system, and I'm guessing there are other people in mine, but I've experienced people in your language system. There's overlap between ours. But if I met someone in the way you're describing them, I would at least incorporate psychopathy and antisocial into that, in that they... and I actually conceive of those people, it's hard to know, and there's data that refutes this or doesn't support it, but that early in life, they were socialized, given their environment, to exert power and really totally turn off their empathy in order to cope with their environment. Either modeling, they found that they were overpowered or they saw people overpowering other people to get their needs met. But whatever reason, it's a part of their personality that everyone is a instrument to them getting their needs met, which you're describing, and it certainly is a part of narcissism. Is certainly a part of psychopathy and antisocial, and so there's a Venn diagram with that too. But so I guess the label and the way you conceive of that label and your application of that label is, just over here and mine's over here. There's overlap.
Yeah, I mean, what you're describing, I think, is actually a rather sympathetic exhibition of narcissism. It's really rather sympathetic. I mean, the examples that you're giving are people who still are involved, who want a relationship. They don't just want to be loved in a kind of one-sided admiration landscape.
I mean, they want, but deep down, they have a deeper want, I guess. If they could really experience and accept over a long period of time uncomplicated love that doesn't involve admiration, then they would relax. And those are the people that I've treated over time. It takes a long time. I mean, we're talking like 5 years of treatment.
Right. But see, by definition, you're talking about people who have sought out treatment and who have been willing to stay.
Them, which obviously they're not high on the spectrum. But I've also treated couples where the spouse, the narcissistic spouse, was dragged in totally against their will, and have convinced the narcissistic person that there's a path to getting them what they want that won't feel natural to them, and it takes a long time, and they'll blow me off and say that I'm stupid and all this kind of stuff, but over time, like, they eventually get there, and they have all those kinds of qualities where they can't admit that they did anything wrong, and they have a pretty full blossomed version of the disorder, maybe not at the higher end. But yeah, I mean, and people, I've talked about narcissism on the podcast before, and on the internet, I get a lot of people saying, I think you're discounting the terribleness that these narcissistic people are capable of, you know what I mean? And I don't want to do that. I am aware of it. I've experienced it personally in my life. I've experienced the 80% narcissistic person in my personal life. People close to me, people in control of my life. It has been abusive. It's horrible. I get sweaty palms just bringing those people to mind. I'm not even talking about them. It's traumatic. These people are horrible. I mean, no better way to put it. It's just like they can be really, really terrible, and scary,
Right.
And I'm not going to discount that, but I having been in contact with these people and having, I think, the privilege of being able to treat them, I've figured out, for at least the people I've treated, a path, although a long one, to actually getting their needs met in a functional way and getting them to reduce their reactivity that ends up harming other people significantly.
That's fantastic. That's really great. I'm so glad to know that you're doing that.
Yeah.
Because a lot of people either won't work with people like that, or people like that don't feel the connection, I guess. Somehow you've let them know that you have enough empathy, but with good boundaries to help that come out.
I mean, it's similar with all personality disorders, really. It's, or many of them anyway. They tend to provoke a fair amount of countertransference in us. And if not properly conceptualized, we will be like, no, not this person. I don't. This person's a lost cause or whatever.
So, but one of the interesting things is, so you're dealing with it from a psychological and psychodynamic point of view, which is wonderful. From another point of view, from a societal point of view, what can end up happening is that people, let's say they need mediation. It comes up a lot in family law situations, which is to say divorce situations, where people have managed to kind of work out their relationships up to a certain point, and then they get into a divorce situation, and then things go wild. You know, like the person who was kind of controlling the relationship in some way, going forward, now becomes all bets are off. They want to get what they want to get. You know, that happens, and I understand that. What becomes particularly difficult is that sometimes they end up in mediation situations where attorneys or mediators think that they think that they have a real beat on this. They think that they really understand, that they can tell when somebody has these characteristics. And what they don't understand is that the dynamic can be such that one person can just look at the other one a certain way and communicate that they'd better do X, Y, Z. They better shut up. They better, do what I say. They better let this alone. They better not bring this up. And you end up in a situation where you can't possibly come up with a fair result. And so I really think this is important for people pretty much I want to say in all walks of life. That might be an exaggeration, but certainly, there are a lot more ways that people need to be educated on this dynamic than we realize.
Including attorneys and judges and those people, as they're watching that play out, they might have to, narcissistically informed legal practices would mean like, just because they're saying all the words of negotiation and accommodation and meeting in the middle, the relational person might still be getting the shaft.
Yeah, and what's really horrifying is that the relational person, has been going through a lot of this, being on the receiving end of this stuff. So what can end up happening, quite frankly, is that the relational person can actually seem paranoid, highly neurotic, obstreperous, like they just complain about everything. They can seem as if they're creating obstacles to they won't agree to anything because they're saying, you don't understand, that's what this really means. And they actually might be right, but from everybody else's point of view, they just seem to be impossible. And so the quote relational person, the person who's been targeted by these behaviors, might not be very likable. And the courts or the lawyers or the therapists, they all might think, you're really a pain in the neck.
And the narcissistic person is very adept
lovely. They seem so lovely.
Impression management.
Exactly. Yeah. And that becomes really complex. And then if you get to a situation where the children don't want to be with one or the other parent, and then it looks like one of the parents might be accused of alienation, and it gets very, very complex. And all I can think of is that people need to at least become more educated about what these dynamics are like.
Yeah, absolutely. And the kids might be terrified of the consequences because they've seen it at home. Because as I said earlier, there's a profile of a narcissistic person who will never let out their ugly side in public.
Never. And
let it out in full glory at home. And the kids, having witnessed that in court, might, say, yeah, we want to go with dad, even though dad's the one who, and I want to be clear, I've treated plenty of female narcissistic people. It tends, on prevalence-wise, according to stats and according to my anecdote, it's more of a male thing.
Yeah, that is the statistic.
They're socialized that way as the counterpoint or the sister diagnosis is borderline. That's more prevalent for women because the idea is that men are socialized to be independent and to not care. And so when they're faced with the traumas of growing up, there's a more likelihood of them edging towards superiority as a coping style as opposed to the preoccupied attachment style of people with borderline.
I just want to make one comment about what you said, where children would go to courts and say, I want to go with one parent or the other. Courts usually don't want the child's input because they don't want to put the child in the middle. So I just wanted to clarify.
Yeah, well, that's good. I didn't know that. Because you hear that. You hear like stories of kids being put on the stand and saying, which parent do you want to be? I mean, did they used to do that in the past?
I don't know. I can't say, but I've read things, and also I know from various cases that in general the court does not look kindly upon that. Even sometimes the kids want to say something, but it's not necessarily going to work for you.
They don't want to put the kids in that position. Mm-hmm. It might make you look bad because
exactly.
It's like, oh, how did that kid get to that point? Are they saying that because they think they should, or were they coached to say that?
Yeah, it could backfire.
Yeah, interesting. Interesting. Well, what else have we not got to on this topic?
Well, so one of the questions I think is always interesting is how, when you do have a dynamic between, for lack of better words, relational and transactional person, is how does that happen? Like how does the transactional person walk into a room, scan it, and go, I think you'll be a good target? And it's an interesting quandary. Like on the one hand, I think it's really just kind of, they do it to everybody. So if they're looking for someone to admire them, they might just cast a wide net and see what happens. But as I started to study this, I was at a party once, and I was sitting with these 3 other women, which happened to be a perfect example. They were sort of the perfect example of 3 different ways of looking at something. And one woman was basically saying that she wanted to go away on a trip to another country, and she loves to travel, and she's just going to go alone, and she doesn't want to be part of a group. She's just going to go alone and work out her own thing. And then another woman said, oh, wow, I could never do that. I mean, I've been widowed now for 10 years, and I live in this big house, and I'd be happy to take somebody with me, but I could never go alone, and I could never plan that out myself. And then the third person said, well, I could see myself going on a trip, but I'd want to go with a group, and I'd want to have somebody who would plan it all out, and I'd be around other people. So as I was studying this, I was thinking, wow, this is actually pretty interesting, because if I were somebody who was looking to take advantage of someone, I'd go with number 2. I'd go with the woman who's been all alone for 10 years. She doesn't seem to have anybody looking out for her. She lives in a big house. She's probably got money. She's offering to take somebody else, so she's at least got enough money to burn in that way. I'd like to explore that possibility if I were that person. And so it's actually not that difficult, because people who are vulnerable, they wear it on their sleeves. They're very quick to say that they're lonely, or that they, there are ways to find out. You ask what their relationships are with their family. If they don't have anybody, they're not close to anybody, or they don't have a lot of friends, or they sit at home a lot on their own. They don't know how to manage their time. These are all people who, they maintain good eye contact. They're good listeners. They never change the subject. The narcissist can just keep talking ad nauseum about him or herself, and these other people don't change the subject. They don't roll their eyes. They don't, they continue to admire them. It's really pretty straightforward. And then what the narcissist, or if the person has even more nefarious ideas, then what they do is they sort of test you. Like they'll say something small that isn't really small, but something, and they see how the person reacts. So let's say they say, well, that was stupid. Why would you say that? Now, a relational person won't make too much of that. The relational person will think, well, maybe it was stupid. I mean, I'm not the most brilliant person in the world. So they just kind of let it go. But that's actually not a nice thing to say to somebody. Well, that was stupid, really? And so they'll just put out these little bombs, and see how the person reacts. And then if
or
they
a more
react,
subtle thing would be like, well, I don't think you understand the full situation. That kind of thing.
Yep. Perfect example. I mean, it's subtle enough, but it communicates disdain and superiority. So then what happens is, if the person puts up with it, if the person doesn't say, you know what, that was really rude, I'm out, right? Just like that, the narcissistic person, or the predator, or however you want to call it in this case, that person, first of all, sees you as a fool, and secondly, believes that now you deserve to be treated this way. So it justifies their contempt. And then it sort of builds from there.
Right.
But then what happens is that the relational person becomes so invested that they're not likely to leave. And at that point, it's when the transactional person understands that that person is invested, that then they can kind of go to town, because that's where the rage might come out, because they know that they're not going to leave. So it's a combination of confirmatory bias plus intermittent behaviors, and then investment. So the confirmatory bias, if you're nice to start with, it'll become very difficult for the person to take in any information that contradicts their initial impression, the initial positive impression.
Right.
The intermittent reinforcement then comes where you sort of test and you say something nasty or something dismissive, but then you say something nice, so that the person never quite knows where they stand. And then once the person has invested themselves, they're very unlikely. They value something more highly because they've invested their time and energy, and they're less and less likely to leave.
Right. And they've been beaten down emotionally to the point where they start to believe that they are stupid and they are irrelevant, or they are lesser. They do need their narcissistic partner to survive, or their opinions don't make any sense. People use the phrase gaslighting, I think a little bit too liberally these days, but that absolutely can happen too, inadvertently even, or advertently, where the person ends up not really trusting their own perceptions of the situation. It's just like, well, I have notions that I feel like my spouse is being abusive to me, but my spouse has effectively convinced me that I deserve it, or that it's normal, or that I don't see things correctly, because they always manage to convince me otherwise. And so maybe I am wrong about this, and it just continues to compound in that way.
I mean, I think it could be argued that if you have, let's say, a line, a continuum, and in the middle is 0, and to the right is positive numbers, and to the left are negative numbers. If you go from 0 to 10, let's say, on the positive side of a person having narcissistic characteristics, then the relational person will tolerate it to the extent that they match that person in the negative. So if a person is a 10 on a narcissism scale, let's say, the person who's only a -5 on the relational scale won't put up with the 10. That person who's at -5, they'll be like, I am out here. This is ridiculous. But if that person is also a 10, meaning hyper-relational to match the opposite narcissism, they'll stay until the narcissist discards them, basically.
Yeah. Or forever. I mean, I've treated couples like, I don't know about forever, but definitely years and years and years.
Well, if the narcissist doesn't discard them, sometimes what happens is that the person loses their value. So one of the characteristics of narcissism can be that they are very invested in idealized love. And what that the way that translates out is that you really can never maintain that idealized position. I mean, the relational person can never quite be so idealized, because that's the kind of I love being in love thing. So the minute you've got a baby with a dirty diaper, and one person says, "Oh, could you please bring me a new diaper?" You're no longer idealized, right? So that's where one example of how it can start to go downhill.
Right.
But if the person is invested in idealized anything, you're going to fall from that position, because the relational person is looking for an actual relationship, not for only being idealized.
Right.
Somewhere in there, they want to have a relationship. So they'll fall from that grace, and that's when the narcissistic type person will begin to look elsewhere.
Right. Have affairs as a common.
Yeah, it's just a matter of time.
Right.
It's like it's time-stamped.
Yeah.
Like the relationship has a timestamp on it.
Right. Because in my conceptualization, as they bump up against the frustration for both people that they're not getting their needs met, even though they are trying in dysfunctional ways, the narcissistic person, they have in their mind this idea that they're entitled to this idealized love that's often punted into our heads from propaganda. I think we all have this false notion of what love is supposed to look like, from rom-coms and stuff.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and songs. I mean, that's another thing. I mean, that's a whole other topic. But I really think that songs are almost a form of hypnotism, where you grow up listening to certain songs and you're hypnotized. I mean, you sing them and you begin to believe them. So the narcissistic person who enjoys his or her version of songs will have these songs about, oh, she's the most wonderful person, he's the most wonderful person, this is what I love. The relational person will be listening to songs that are basically saying, I don't like you, but I love you. Seems that I'm always thinking of you. You've really got a hold on me. You know, these are songs where you're actually, love has no pride. Bonnie Raitt had a song, Love Has No Pride. You're actually taught, and you reinforce it yourself, that if I expect to always feel good about it, that's not love. And I'm the first to say, loving relationships can be complicated. But if you find yourself on the receiving end of what really might be abusive behaviors, I would have to question that. But and then there's the other thing, is the perversion of fairy tales. That we listen, like a lot of women will say how you have to kiss 1,000. The fairy tale is that you have to kiss 100 frogs before you find your prince. But what people will turn that into is you have to kiss a frog 100 times before he turns into a prince, right? So you get this perverted sense of that you can make somebody change, even if they have zero desire to change.
Yeah.
Even the story of Beauty and the Beast. There's the story of how this man who looks like a beast actually has a heart of gold inside.
Right.
He can be very loving, but somehow the message is that the beauty can turn the beast into a good person because she kissed him in the myth. But the whole idea is that it's unusual. It's not the norm for a beast to be a good person. The norm is, if you see a beast, you should run. And still, that you can't make somebody change. It's got to be inside him or her inherently.
Yeah, so much socialization to little boys and girls. Yeah. That as boys, the ideal is to be the beast, but to have a soft side, but you got to be the beast. You got to be assertive and masculine and sure of yourself and dangerous at times and to be feared. Your wife should kind of be afraid of you and your big chest, and
never cry.
And never cry.
Right.
And, always jump in the battle and, always know the thing and never cry. And the woman, the Marge Simpson, needs to figure out how to wrangle the masculinity of the husband. Oh, he'll be stupid and he'll drink too much and he won't care about, he'll quote unquote help with the parenting, but you gotta mold your husband, into some, instead of just like expecting another human being to be a fucking human being. You know what I mean? Just grow the fuck up, Homer. Like you're not helping with parenting. Just be a parent. You're not a child anymore. Like wake up. Yeah, I mean, we have a long way to go, and we're starting. Some of the Disney cartoons are trying. They still have problems in it, but I mean, it's not Disney, but Shrek, for example, the princess didn't turn him into a prince, except they did in I think 3, and they went back. But anyway, not to spoil it, but they changed. Isn't that right? Didn't they change the woman? The princess had a spell on her where at nighttime or at some point she would turn into a troll or whatever they call those. Shrek isn't he a troll anyway? And then she chose to be a troll permanently, and so they could be together. And so it was a different. Anyway, there's Disney shows are trying to subvert that because they're starting to be aware. Again, they still have problems, but maybe in 100 years. That generation will not be as deluded about gender or rigid about gender and about what romance is supposed to look like. That's my hope anyway. Yeah. So, I mean, to extend that to narcissism, all those shows are essentially saying men are supposed to be narcissistic and transactional, and women are supposed to be self-sacrificing and relational, right? It's going back to Fred Flintstone and Wilma, same dynamic. It's just been through the ages. The Honeymooners, with Jackie Gleason and his wife, it was always that way. It's just awful that we do this to our kids, that we teach them that. And then subtly tell them that they're not supposed to be that way when we've absolutely been pumping that into their heads the whole time. Anyway, what else haven't we gotten to? We've got to everything that you wanted to talk about in terms of narcissism?
I'm trying to think. It's been a great conversation.
Well, Fran, it's been a fascinating conversation. I always love talking about personality disorders with people, and I've learned a little bit. I've learned a little bit about, because people email me, I think, from your camp of the conceptualization of narcissism, that I need to be aware that there's different spheres of defining. Like I'm guessing if you and I ran across a case. Many cases we would agree, okay, that person has a narcissistic personality, that person has psychopathy, but there would be some people that I would probably characterize as psychopathic, and you would characterize them as narcissistic. They'd sort of be in the middle there somewhere.
Well, okay, so that's actually another area that I think can be discussed. I don't know if we want to do it now or at another time, but there can be this heavy overlay between narcissism and psychopathy. And or antisocial, sociopath, psychopath. Those are for the listeners that can be encompassed in those. So there can be a really heavy overlay, and I think when we get to looking at people in the court system, or when people are getting divorces, and when you talk about high conflict behaviors, I think there really can be a heavy overlay with the psychopathy. And even when people, I think in general, when people talk about these really difficult, horrible relationships where they're suffering, whether they know it or not, I actually think that there probably is a high overlay of antisocial behaviors. It may not be someone who fulfills full criteria for antisocial personality disorder, but the behaviors can be quite cruel. And again, the relational person can be misunderstanding the signs. I've heard so many people talk about, well, at least he's honest, when in fact it's cruelty, he or she. So I think that is really, really important to pay attention to, because I think a lot of people are suffering in these relationships when they don't quite realize how terrible it is. I'm glad that a lot of, particularly women, will kind of awaken to what's going on when they see their children suffering. I'm glad that they do that. But however, I really feel like I wish that women and men would become aware of it, simply because it's damaging to oneself. Right.
But again, you have to have that sense of self to even be alerted to the fact that you matter, for sure. One last example, then we'll adjourn, is I have the pleasure of a colleague of mine, Dr. James Manley, who was actually the psychologist who was providing the parenting evaluation for Josh Powell.
Oh, wow.
You might remember him.
Oh, my gosh.
For the listeners, he was the person who was highly suspected of killing his wife in Utah, but was never convicted or charged anyway. He came with his two boys to Washington State near Seattle, and long story short, the state decided to investigate Josh Powell and his parenting of his kids, and his kids were actually taken away and then were started to give them back with supervised visits by a social worker. Meanwhile, my friend and colleague, Dr. James Manley, was evaluating for a future court date Josh Powell's ability to parent. He would do these observations, and he was starting to write that report. And unfortunately, because he was pushed into a corner around his potential sexual crimes, Josh Powell killed his two boys and killed himself in a very dramatic fashion. The social worker was bringing the kids to the house, and Josh Powell grabbed his two sons, pushed the social worker out of the house, slammed the door, locked it, proceeded to murder his two kids, and then lit the entire house on fire and burned to the ground. It's a very tragic, horrific example, and traumatic for that social worker particularly. And Dr. James Manley came on my podcast and recounted the entire event from beginning to end. And his conclusion was that Josh Powell had narcissistic personality disorder. And at the time, I didn't have the same conceptualization as I do now, but with my current conceptualization, I would look at that and say, like, oh, that's one of those examples where I would call that psychopathy with narcissism. He's calling it narcissism with psychopathy. And I think that's part of that just decision that all of us have to make in terms of like where we draw the line. Is it bluish green or is it greenish blue?
Right. And that's why I think it's so important to be grounded in the behaviors. Because if you get too caught up, I mean, believe me, I think diagnosis is an important tool. And I think it's important that it be done well. I think it's important that a differential diagnosis be done thoroughly, so that it's not just what does fulfill the criteria, but what might better fulfill the criteria. So I really think that that's important. But there are also times when, whether it's narcissism with a smattering of the antisocial, or whether it's essentially antisocial with certain narcissistic behaviors, the really important thing is to look at the behaviors and to see what the effects are and where to go with that.
Right. Yeah. And when we as clinicians are treating and conferring, we don't just say, oh, they're narcissistic, and know exactly what we're talking about. We're like, okay, let's talk about it. What do you see? Why do you apply that label? And then if another clinician is like, well, that kind of sounds more like psychopathy with narcissism to me, but who cares? We're describing the individual, and let's just work on that description.
Right. I mean, one of the frustrations is that this is probably as much an art as it is a science, and that, maybe at some future time, we're going to have various names for things that we now hold under one rubric.
Right.
And that's why I really think it's so important for people to do this responsibly. But part of the responsibility is also to be willing to look at the behaviors and to acknowledge what's going on and the dangers that can occur within them.
Well, thanks for coming on the podcast, Fran.
Thank you for having me.
Definitely in my zone here, as the podcast listeners will know. I love talking about this sort of thing. And like I said, I've learned a little bit, which is great. And I know the listeners have as well.
Oh, so have I. Thank you.
Yeah. So please take care of yourself out there. And Fran, I'm going to ask you, why do you think the listeners out there should keep care of themselves and keep care of other people?
Why should they keep care of themselves and keep care of other people? Because that's what it's all about. Relationship is so important, and part of relationship is taking care of yourself so that you can be present and you can be active and have positive relationships with all the people you know.
Yeah, beautifully said. Thanks, Fran.
Thank you.